Hello, and welcome to a Monticello live stream. I'm Melanie Boyer. Thank you all for being with us today. During this Women's History Month at Monticello, we've been talking about the women that lived and worked here at Monticello. A couple of weeks ago, we discussed some of the enslaved women at Monticello. And today we're going to be talking about some of the free white women of the Jefferson family that lived at Monticello. While the lives of the enslaved and the free women were inseparable, their experiences were vastly different. And most of the time we have more documentation or material culture to tell us about the lives of the free women at Monticello than the enslaved women. Today I'm joined by my colleagues, Associate Curator of Decorative Arts, Diane Ehrenpreis, Associate Curator Emilie Johnson, and Senior Historian and Donor Relation Officer, Ann Lucas. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and they're going to tell us a little bit more about the free white Jefferson women and how we know what we know about them.
Thank you, Melanie, and hello, colleagues. It's nice to see you, and hello to all the ships at sea. It's nice to welcome all of our friends to Monticello today. I just want to set the scene a little bit, and perhaps we could show that image of the Monticello West Front. It sort of grounds us in place, as well as gives you an idea of a feel for what some of the, at least young women at Monticello around 1815, 1820, what they may have looked like, how they might have dressed. I think you might be able to see them there in the middle of the lawn. But we're going to try and perhaps cover about 3 generations worth of women's experiences in at least an introductory way. And I wanted to make sure, though, that you hear from both my colleagues before I start with Mrs. Jefferson. I'm calling out Emilie Johnson, who is also in the curatorial department. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the things you'll touch on today?
Sure. Thanks, Diane. And hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here with you. So I'm going to focus on a woman who lived at Monticello for about 17 years towards the end of her life, Thomas Jefferson's youngest sister, and Scott Jefferson Marks. And she's somebody that one of the things that we'll talk about over and over again are the kinds of materials that we use to recover women's history. And these are objects when they survive, documents, letters, journals, account books, images when we have them. And Scott Jefferson Marks is a really interesting figure because none of these things really tend to survive for her. So she's an example of somebody, how we can try to recreate a life through the lenses of other people for the most part. And so I'll be talking a lot about what we can learn, sort of what we can discern about her through a bunch of secondary references. And then I'd love to sort of take Diane's lovely invitation and turn it over to Anne and hear from Anne about what she'll be presenting.
Thanks, you two. It's such a pleasure to be on the screen with both of you ladies today. My experience at Monticello doing research on women is focused primarily on a 3rd generation Monticello resident, and that is Jefferson's granddaughter, Ellen Wayles Randolph, who later marries Joseph Coolidge. So Ellen Wayles Randolph Coolidge. And I have the opposite problem that Emilie has, where I have way more documentary evidence than I can humanly process. And there are many colleagues hard at work on all of the documents that Ellen Coolidge and her family have generated for us, including my co-editor for Ellen's diary, Lisa Francavilla, and also Krista Dirkseide is working on Ellen as well. So what I'll look at is, how does this 3rd generation woman learn to write? What are the types of records that she leaves, and what's the legacy that she inspires in her family that has helped us arrive with Monticello being one of the most well-documented plantations in the country. So without further ado, I'll hand it back to Diane so we can start at the beginning.
All right. This is this is going to be a good midday exchange, a good conversation. I love this topic. Perhaps could we put on my first slide, and we'll get to the sort of early years at Monticello. I wanted to sort of share more of a personal experience as far as a project that I've worked on and sort of the realizations of the exciting successes of surviving material and the real dearth of documents, and how I tried to get around that in order to learn more and put together a stronger biography of Martha Jefferson. So my work on Martha Jefferson, who you can see her dates there. She was actually born, I should give you a little background, don't want to presume too much. She was born Martha Wayles down in Charles City County, and from a wealthy family. Her father was an English immigrant, and her mother came from a old Virginia family, even by 1748 standards, the Epps family. John Wayles was a merchant, a lawyer, and a slave trader. So she was well educated. She moved in the circles with the Byrds and the Carters and so on down along the James River, and all of those famous River Road plantations were scenes of her early life. And she could read, she could write, she was musical. She'd read the classics, some of her books survive. And so knowing that part of her story, a number of years ago, we decided to first install what we call today the South Pavilion. Many of you might recognize it as part of the attached to the main body of Monticello that you see today by a terrace. But originally this was a freestanding brick building, and we have a artist rendering of what that would have looked like around 1773 or 74. You see there at the top of the screen. It's a freestanding brick building. There was one room above and one room below. And Thomas Jefferson, Martha, and at least a couple of their children lived in this one room. Really, I'd like to point out to people, anyone who's been an urban dweller, it was akin to sort of living in a studio apartment, very comfortable, very fine living compared to standard experience for other Virginians at that time. But while they were there, Jefferson had designed, and the enslaved builders were building what we call Monticello 1, and you can see a rendering of what that structure looked like. So I was charged with trying to find evidence for how this space might have been furnished. And this is when I started to come up against the realization that we don't have diaries from Martha Jefferson or really any of her contemporaries. There are very few letters that survive. And what we do have is sparse. So you have to be very careful. You have to be a close reader and pull some clues out of both what survives from her, which is an account book, which includes material about foodways at Monticello, buying chickens or eggs or produce from the enslaved, fabulous lists of housewares that were at Monticello around 1777. Clues from that list let me know that there was both a cradle and a crib used, because I could tell from the bedding that she lists, she identifies that there were both types of beds for infants at Monticello. So pulling all of that together and marrying it with Thomas Jefferson's surviving financial records, we were able to get a pretty good idea of how this space was used, and for our purposes, how it was furnished. So, tall bedstead with curtains and a tester, and also a chest of drawers that I will tell you a little bit more in a moment. But I was surprised to find out that there were only 4 letters that survived from Martha Jefferson. And I thought, oh, well, I'll just work backwards. I will go and check collections of papers for her sisters, for example. One was Mrs. Epps, and one was, two of them were in the Skipwith family, and there were no papers to be found. And I tried this for a few other women who I thought Martha might have corresponded with, and came to the realization that others had already come to, that these letters were gone, that there probably had been letters, and they're just missing. And we had a clue that a colleague shared where it suggested that someone had asked Rebecca Coles about Mrs. Jefferson's letters, almost really indicating that perhaps Thomas Jefferson himself may have inquired of Rebecca Coles, Martha Jefferson's friend, and asked her for Martha's letters back, asked for Mrs. Jefferson's letters, because they were no longer in Mother's cap drawer. And it seems to be reasonable to think that Jefferson not only gathered up his own correspondence with his wife, but also went out and claimed letters that she may have written, collected it, and almost certainly destroyed it. This is not particularly unusual. Martha Washington destroyed her correspondence with George Washington. Their letters no longer survive. So it has, a precedent of happening. So so there's that takes away a women's history, women's voice, their own autobiography. When your letters are gone, you're really silencing someone. And of course, women were incredibly busy. Many women didn't have time to keep up a correspondence, even if they were educated and had access to writing materials. Didn't have time to keep a diary. It was just a rare practice in general. So we're already at a minus column compared to looking at the paper trail that many white men of a certain class leave behind. So, but there were these 4 letters, and the 4 letters really set me on a very interesting project. I'm showing you one of them. This is all in Martha Jefferson's hand, and it was written on August 8th, 1780. And all of them are essentially pretty much the same copy. They're alerting contacts of hers, other women in Virginia in 1780. Just to point out, we're at the height of the Revolutionary War. And things have been going badly. The war has shifted to the South, and the Virginia militia really suffered a huge loss in South Carolina. And so the women in Virginia were starting to really see firsthand the suffering of what was happening in the Revolution. A campaign, a ladies' campaign, started in Philadelphia earlier that year, and Martha Washington was part of it. And there was a broadside called "The Sentiments of an American Woman," which was a rousing piece of essentially propaganda, telling American women that they should be like the Roman matron, that they need to give of themselves, to give of their wealth, to give of their personal adornments, not just give their sons and husbands to the nation. So in looking at this letter, we're now very clear in understanding that Mrs. Washington sent these broadsides to Martha Jefferson, and Mrs. Jefferson wrote these letters, and I'm sure she wrote more to other contacts in different counties around Virginia, but we only have 4 left. So she included the broadsides to be dispersed. There were sermons preached in churches encouraging women to go out, collect whatever they could as far as donations, free will donations, regardless of your class or your wealth. Will take anything. Of course, this did not include enslaved women. Make these donations, and they were to be sent back to Richmond. And I remind you, at this time, Martha Jefferson is the First Lady of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson is the governor. So this ladies' campaign really had remarkable success. And by November, diamond earrings, wedding rings, pistarines, gold coins, species were coming in, all addressed to Mrs. Jefferson in Richmond. And at that very time is exactly when the first British invasion happens in December 1780, and it really sort of blows apart the campaign. The intended use of the funds falls apart, and the very women who were so patriotic, and I should say military families and elite families in Fredericksburg gave money, the Amblers and the Randolphs, and a number of kinship groups you can see in the list of people who are sending money. They're patriots, and we need to make sure that their role is recognized, and also Martha Jefferson's. So that's a bit of the story about these letters, and I'm working on that. But I wanted to make sure that people know a little bit more about a methodology that's very dear to my heart, and that would be how we use material culture to learn more about particularly women's history. If we could have the other slide. Great, thank you. A wonderful scholar, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, has written about material culture as an avenue where we can learn about women. We can use objects when we are lacking in documentation and parse out more information about someone's life, their class, their experience, by looking at the things that they owned or that they made or that they used. So I've definitely been applying that, not just to Mrs. Jefferson, but really almost every project I do at Monticello, I try and see what the objects can tell us. So briefly, I want to make sure right up front that you recognize another stumbling block that we've had is there are no portraits of Martha Jefferson. And it does make me wonder if there had been, perhaps Jefferson parted with that when the letters went. We don't know for sure, but I think that when I ran across this portrait, I think it's a really interesting comparable. It evokes an idea of what Martha Jefferson might have looked like. Don't focus so much on the face, and we know she had fairer hair. But this painting is actually of Lucy Skelton Gilliam, and Lucy was Martha Jefferson's sister-in-law from her first marriage. So very close, both in kinship, also in class, and you can see the finery that she's wearing. I checked that list of clothing that Martha Jefferson left us, and she tells us she had 8 silk gowns. So seeing Lucy in this clearly beautiful yellow silk gown with lace and ribbons, and I think she might be wearing a small timepiece there, evokes what a formal Martha Jefferson might have looked like. And I find that very helpful for me to extrapolate outwards. Just briefly, we have some of her silver that survives. Jefferson did melt down some of the silver from their married life and reuse it in Jefferson cups, I believe, or other pieces of silver. But these are silver salts, and we have a few other examples when you come visit. We have some textiles like this needle case we think is from Martha Jefferson, and a very poignant pincushion, which you would have used. Maybe it would have been a suitable gift to a young mother after having a baby. They would actually pin clothing on, pin their clothing, including infant clothing was pinned. So a pincushion was very important. But very briefly, I just want to point out this object, the family called it Mrs. Jefferson's Bureau. It is in its rightful place in Thomas Jefferson's room. And it dates to Williamsburg circa 1770. And we feel very strongly that we have identified that this object was Martha Jefferson's, that she used it. If you look, you can see there are little knobs there. If you pull out that section, it's called a slide, and it's a writing surface, which brings us full circle back to what we know in part of one of the contributions that Martha Jefferson made was as a correspondent, and I wish we knew more about it. So I'm going to leave it at that and have my colleagues weigh in on some of their amazing projects and how they've been able to get at the information that can be very hard to locate.
Great. Oh, thanks so much, Diane. So everyone, thank you for being with us. And my part of the talk is basically, taking what Diane has shared with us about the few letters that remain, the importance of correspondence, the importance of material culture to be able to read the details of a person's life, and basically call it even less, because that's what I have to try to recover the life of Anne Scott Jefferson Marks. Just very briefly, she was Thomas Jefferson's youngest sister. She was 12 years younger than him, born in 1755, so of the same generation as Martha Jefferson, but younger. She marries in 1787. She is widowed in 1811, and she herself dies in 1828 at the age of 73. So you have someone who has a long life, and of course notice that I mark up that life chronologically through her marital state. And if we could, I'd love to go to my first slide, please. So when we're thinking about someone like Anne Scott Jefferson Marks, she is recoverable through other people's letters. And through other people's words, I found a woman whose life is characterized by a combination of dependence and domination over others. She is born to privilege, but she doesn't live up to the quote unquote feminine ideal of her time, that sort of Roman matriarchal power that Diane referenced in Martha Jefferson's correspondence. Throughout her life, she is findable, but she's constantly, one of the ways that she's findable actually is by tracing her interactions with enslaved people. She is active in the slave market throughout her life. She inherits a woman and her children upon at the death of her father when she's 2 years old. At the age of 24, she sells that woman and her children. And again, throughout her life, you see her relying on enslaved people to care for her, to make her comfortable, but also to rent and to sell when she needs money. I became interested in Anne Scott Jefferson Marks because most of the mentions of her describe her later in her life. So my first question is, what was she like when she was younger? And through Jefferson's buying records, we see someone who Jefferson's buying things for his sister. And he's buying her curls in Williamsburg in the 1770s, hair combs, paste jewelry. He buys her a calico gown in London in 1786. And so we see someone who is sociable, who's out in the world. What does this matter? What can these little bits tell us? We see a young woman out in the world. She is clearly out in society. She's engaging with people. And you get, and her sister then describes her, a personality that is pleasant, that is cheerful, someone about whom her relatives felt tenderness. Again, these just kind of build out the details of a life. The only object, I'm showing you on the left, a press that's in Monticello. This is the only object that we have tightly associated with Anne Scott Jefferson Marks. And this piece is known to us through a letter by her niece, who is giving this object to one of her daughters. And I realize it's a web of family connection here, but basically Martha Jefferson Randolph is giving her daughter Aunt Marks's press, something that we believe may have been made at Monticello for her. But again, getting back to this incomplete story, we know Anne Scott Jefferson Marks through this constant, really, engagement with enslaved people. And again, at the end of her life, we get yet another insight into her. She is described, she's in her early 70s, and she's very sick. She has had a tendency for being a hypochondriac throughout the course of her life, but this time is actually real. She is really, really ill. And there's this really interesting and poignant description of her and a woman named Scylla, who is tending her. One of Scott Jefferson Marks' nieces describes that Scylla has been nursing her overnight and has been very patient with her through Anne Marks is not an easy personality. She is, as she comes across in the correspondence, she's a busybody. I mentioned she's a bit of a hypochondriac. She's in everybody's business. She is kind of pushy. And Scylla is described as bearing all of that ill humor with great patience. Of course, she had to as an enslaved woman, but these are women who, Melanie brought up the point that the lives of the white women that we're focusing on and enslaved women are really so tightly interconnected through the lens of Monticello. This is a woman who was 7 years younger than Anne Scott Jefferson Marks, Scylla was. They were born at the same plantation. These are women whose lives had intersected over the course of both of their lives and really coming again to touch towards the end of Anne Scott Jefferson Marks's life. If I can go to my next slide. One of the things, in the absence of direct correspondence, you can read people through others. And I bring up this interchange, also underlying the point that Anne Scott Jefferson Marks doesn't live up to the feminine ideal of her time. She's not a good household manager. And this underlies a lot of the comments about her by her nieces and nephews during her life at Monticello, her 17 years at Monticello. And it also underscores this exchange between Jefferson and his daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph. And you see Jefferson is writing and he says, he says, managing Monticello is going to be a lot of work. Why don't we ask my sister to come and help you out? And Martha Jefferson Randolph responds basically, no way. No. And there's a lot of reasons behind Martha Jefferson Randolph's response. But one of the wonderful things that I want you to notice are the dates of these letters. Jefferson writes to his daughter on February 27th, 1809. Martha Jefferson Randolph responds on March 2nd. 1809 is not a leap year. Jefferson is writing from Washington. He's not back at Monticello yet. So this letter from Jefferson leaves Monticello. Remember, it's a 5-day comfortable journey from Monticello to Washington, D.C. during this time period. The mail moves a little bit faster, maybe unlike today. But Jefferson's letter gets out of Washington, gets down to Martha, and clearly she sits down and pounds out this response immediately. This is a sense of the quickest reaction that we can recover between two people corresponding afar. So I love this because it shows the ways that we can use documents, even indirect documents, to get a sense about what people are really feeling, over this one episode, this one tiny episode in a life. But you have these 3 lives and these many lives all converging together. With that and being mindful of time, I want to be sure that we have space for our third presenter, for Anne Scott Jefferson Marks's great niece, Ellen, who didn't really think a whole lot of her, as I remember from the correspondence.
I think that's probably true. So I want to tell the story of Jefferson's granddaughter, and I hesitate to use the word favorite, but I think it may, in fact, be applicable here. And if we could have the first slide, Melanie, I'll tell you a little bit about Ellen Wayles Randolph. So she's the 4th child of Martha Jefferson Randolph and Thomas Mann Randolph. She's born in 1796. And from the beginning, her mother says to Jefferson, Ellen is wonderfully apt. So she dictates her first letter to Jefferson in the fall of 1801. And just a few weeks after her 5th birthday, she writes to Jefferson when he is in the president's house. And by age 8, we're seeing her first letter on the screen that she writes to him there. And Jefferson responds by saying to Ellen, "You have 1,000 little things to tell me, which I am fond to hear." And he then goes on to say, "But other people can tell me certain details. Only you can tell me the following things." And my point is that he teaches her how to observe and he teaches her how to write. And Jefferson schools Ellen from that moment on and rewards her for being a good correspondent. So she then writes to him about everything that's happening at Monticello while he's absent. Her letters will tell about bulbs that are sprouting, chicks that are hatching, anything that is going on the mountaintop, she's filling him in. So when Jefferson returns to Monticello in retirement, Ellen, along with her siblings and her mother, Martha, move into the house. And that's where the real education begins. Jefferson's giving her volumes of Shakespeare and Homer. He's giving her fountain pens that never need to be mended. He's giving her poems for her scrapbook. He has a writing desk made of his own design for Ellen from wild cherry wood. And this is made by the enslaved joiner John Hemmings. She is living in a room that is directly above Jefferson's. And she remembers in her diary that Jefferson favored Scottish tunes. And she writes, "The music of Scotland may be called the national music of Virginia. We hear Scotch music in our nurseries when we're children, Scotch songs while away the hours of a girl at her needle, and they enable her to cheer and soothe her father's evening hours." So not only is she talking about Jefferson, she's talking about herself and her siblings, and she's talking about her father, Thomas Randolph, who's a little bit of a forgotten man at Monticello because he's schooled in Edinburgh. So that one little snippet is an example of the hundreds of pages that I have from Ellen to work with to flesh out that full story. She marries a man named Joseph Coolidge in 1825, and their marriage bond is there at the bottom of the screen. So here's an example of just one of the many documents that's still in the hands of her descendants. Again, remarkably documented life, childhood life. I mean, she's remarkably documented all the way through. And she is perceived as being quite fierce. I like to think of her as being sort of the first student of the University of Virginia. She has this amazing curriculum that Jefferson and her mother are devising. She has access to Jefferson's library. She is completely immersed in the lives of the people who come to visit Monticello, the artists. Jefferson's physician made the quip that had she not been born a woman, she could have been president. So she's just this amazing, amazing figure. And in 1825, she marries Joseph Coolidge and she leaves Monticello and never returns. Jefferson dies the next year. And one of the most poignant letters is when her husband writes, they've heard that Jefferson is sick, and they write back to Monticello saying, "We're on our way down to see him before he dies." And then the PS, "The bells are tolling for John Adams." So they're writing this after John Adams has died. They're in Boston, which means that Jefferson has already died, unbeknownst to them. So they travel down and learn about Jefferson's death en route. They're around Baltimore. And she talks about never loving a place again after having left Monticello for that last time after Jefferson's death. So one of the interesting pieces of material culture that's associated with Ellen is the desk that Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence on. And she comes to own that in a really interesting way. When she moves from Monticello to her new life in Boston, all of the furniture, all of her belongings is shipped. And en route, while she is going by land and is on her honeymoon, all of her belongings sink. And Jefferson, I think, is equally, if not more devastated than Ellen. And he sends the Declaration of Independence desk as a substitute for that desk that John Hemmings made her that sank en route. And she uses the Declaration desk to write her letters home. So that gives you a sense of how far we've come from her grandmother, whose letters are lost forever, to Ellen being not only encouraged, but equipped, almost demanded to document her life. Next slide, please, Melanie. So one of the things that she does that is so amazing is that she keeps a diary when she travels abroad. And I was doing some research for Monticello and came across this in the collection at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And it's a 400-page document that is just astonishing in its breadth. And from the diary, it's kept in 1838 and 39, we know that a little bit more about Ellen's maid, Sally Cottrell Cole, when she was living in Virginia. And the way we know that is that when she arrives in London, Ellen's husband has hired a maid for her, unbeknownst to her. And she was sort of surprised and taken aback by this idea of having a maid. And this is what she writes. She says, when I was a girl and living in Virginia, I had an excellent lady's maid who did everything for me. When I married and went to New England, where every lady is her own maid and waits upon herself and dresses her own hair, I felt as if I should never be able to perform such Herculean tasks. But in 5 minutes, I had relapsed into old habits, allowed my maid to undress and put me to bed the night of my arrival, and now cannot stick a pen or smooth a hair without her. Will it take me, when I return to Boston, another 13 years to take care of myself again? And so in that little entry in her diary, we learn what Sally Cottrell Cole was doing with Ellen. We understand more. We have more of a sense of the intimacy between a lady's maid, an enslaved lady's maid, and a resident at Monticello than any other document I've seen. So through Ellen's writing and through her documentation, we have this amazing window into another woman's life. Ellen went on to acquire a significant portion of Jefferson's library. She instilled in her family the need to preserve his papers as a way of preserving Jefferson's legacy. Hers was among the voices denying that Jefferson had fathered children with Sally Hemings. And thanks to the Coolidge family, we have preserved Jefferson's farm book. I'm showing you a page of that there on the right. His garden book, his memoranda books, all of those drawings you see at the bottom, that's part of 400 pages, 400 drawings that the Coolidges obtained from their Virginia cousins. They were in an attic being eaten by mice and deposited at the Massachusetts Historical Society, where scholars still today use them as a way of learning more about every aspect, every imaginable aspect of life at Monticello, but also life at neighboring plantations, drawings for great civic monuments like the Virginia State Capitol and the University of Virginia. So Ellen's legacy, as I mentioned at the start, is that we have the great benefit of Monticello being the best documented plantation in the country, and the great duty and obligation as historians to interrogate this evidence. Every generation looks at it anew. Emilie and Diane and I talk a lot about how we might look at the same letter and find something new every single time we ask a question of it. So it's fitting to end with this great abundance of documentation that we have. And I'm happy to share the screen with my colleagues for questions from you.
Well, great. Well, thank you. I've brought everybody back into this screen now. This was really fascinating. Thank you all for sharing this information. I selfishly have a question that I'm hoping to ask about descendants. When we had the live stream on enslaved women at Monticello, we talked a little bit about some of the descendants of the enslaved women, how they would carry on stories with oral history. Is it the same within the Jefferson family? Have the descendants been, you kind of touched on this a little bit, ones who've been keepers of the information and kind of telling us some of what we know?
We are so fortunate to have the descendants of Jefferson still in contact with us. They formed an association in 1916 to maintain the cemetery, and we have, as a foundation, benefited from their generosity in helping us locate objects, but also definitely in sharing the oral traditions. And Diane and Emilie, you may have more to add on that front too.
Invaluable. The descendant correspondences continues on into the 20th century. We have a descendant who is a little Aunt Marks-like in that she was a maiden lady who seemed a little, a little fussy, but she was very engaged in not only trying to record what objects survived, not just in her possession, but in different cousins, different lines, share that information, and also the stories. Some of these stories we know are not true, but a number of the stories actually we've been able to verify and to have eventually. First we have the lead and the letter, then we eventually get the object, and then to put together with the story makes, as Anne was saying, how rich our holdings are. It's when you come here, you see many, many original objects, and we know quite a bit about them because of the descendants. It's not fashionable to talk about relics, but that's how many of these individuals thought about them in the 20th century. And I argue maybe, the idea of a relic is coming around again because of the idea of sentiment, something that you treasure, something that has real meaning. We can all relate to that. And I think maybe putting a little bit of the personal back into object and meaning helps all of us relate to material culture and history in a more accessible way.
Absolutely. Aunt Marks didn't have any descendants herself, but really it's through, as I mentioned a few times, her grandnieces and grandnephews are really how her life is recoverable, because one of the wonderful things about women's correspondence, and I think Diane has shown how much you can gain even from a very limited number of letters, and Anne has an embarrassment of riches, to be honest. I'm a little jealous, but it really, what women do when they're writing back and forth to each other, particularly in the late 18th and early 19th century, is they're talking about their lives. They're doing what Jefferson told Ellen to do. Tell me everything. Tell me all the little bits. And so these letters are full of details, of small details about what daily life was like. And, that included your meddlesome, nuisancey aunt who, had a tendency to fall down the stairs and didn't want to do anything and is kind of lazy and puts you off and, then kind of butts in and starts bugging you. So it really, it's through their words and through the descendants holding on to the one object we have associated. That's how we can bring lives back into focus and into knowledge, which is what's really wonderful.
I might just add to the comments too, is I think in our generation of scholars and folks just before us, we are giving a lot more credence to these letters from these great-great-grandchildren, these people who founded the association and all, because they continue share stories, and we're finding clues that maybe we never thought who would ever be talking about Mrs. Jefferson's bureau in a letter in 1928, but there it is. So yeah, the role of descendants and what they share with us is we wouldn't be as successful as we are today.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up. I would love to keep going with us, but I think we're going to have to wrap it up. I just want to say a huge thank you to you all. I mean, you're fabulous historians and scholars, and this information has been so fascinating. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you for all of you viewing at home. Next week, we'll be bringing you another live stream focusing on women. We'll actually have Abigail Adams here to speak with Thomas Jefferson. So tune in next week for that. And thank you all.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.